Prime Minister said was being held back due to cabinet confidence. In a letter dated June 13, the clerk of the Privy Council declined my request for access to all cabinet confidences in respect of this examination. Mr. Trudeau's legal counsel indicated that the decision on whether to expand the waiver was made by the Privy Council office without the involvement of the Prime Minister or his office. But as we know from this long and sordid, drawn-out affair that we've been witnessing since January, we all know that there's always somebody that can overrule a bureaucrat. And that's exactly what Mr. Trudeau wanted Jody Wilson-Raybould to do. So for him to say that he wasn't part of the decision actually is completely irrelevant, because he always has the power to tell the clerk of the Privy Council what to do. However, I continue reading. Because of the decisions to deny our office further access to cabinet,
just doing a test. I want to see my little preview here. It doesn't look like it's in sync.
Prevented over the entire body of evidence.
Right now my OBS is at 22%, so yeah, I kind of want to see how this looks online.
By Parliament.
Right now, computer at 4650, and I'm just going to be quiet now.
I'm convinced that if our office is to remain truly independent and fulfill its purpose, I must have unfettered access to all information that could be relevant to the exercise of my mandate. I must be satisfied that decisions made by the most senior public office holders, including those discussed at Cabinet, are free from any conflicts of interest. In the present examination, I have gathered sufficient factual information to properly determine the matter on its merits. Because of my inability to access all Cabinet confidences related to the matter, I must, however, report that I was unable to fully discharge the investigatory duties.
Just gonna look at my phone
by the Act. Now,
to see how the stream is doing.
Because the Ethics
If I do have anybody watching, which I don't think I really do,
to get information on Cabinet confidences.
Please let me know in the comments. Actually, I have a
given. Jane Philpott as well, in her interview, said very clearly when she was asked by Vashi Kapelis whether or not there was any further information that she thought was relevant that was covered by the waiver. She's asked, are you in possession of any information that you think the Ethics Commissioner should have had access to? Answer, there are pieces of information that I am aware of that I am not at liberty to speak about. She further goes on later to say, this is Jane Philpott again, so what I would point out to Canadians is what the Ethics Commissioner said, is that he was unable to get enough information to make a determination in terms of whether or not there was a breach of the Conflict of Interest Act or not. So it didn't, in a sense, hold him back from being able to make a determination on this. But I would say, and this is from Jane Philpott again, that I can affirm that there are pieces of information that I am aware of, but that because of the oath that I made to Queen and Country to keep in secret that which shall be kept secret, according to the oath that I made as a cabinet minister, that unless I am released from that obligation, that I am not at liberty to share those pieces of information either with you or with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. So we know that there's more information out there. Jody Wilson-Raybould has said that, as has Jane Philpott, and indeed the Ethics Commissioner attempted to get it. He was unable to get it by virtue of the decision of the Prime Minister. That is not fully cooperating with the Ethics Commissioner, and again, as I said before, that deserves to be reviewed. More importantly, and most recently, there has been the publication of a book. And the book is written by a CBC reporter by the name of Aaron Wary. And in it, Aaron Wary had unprecedented access to the Prime Minister on this topic.
Just gonna go downstairs for a second. I'll leave you guys to watch this live. Incidentally, if you want to watch this without me, I'm watching on C-SPAC on Twitter.
That was not given to the Ethics Commissioner, that the witnesses were not allowed to talk to. And one of those things was what happened after the resignation of Jody Wilson-Raybould, and what happened in the meetings between the Prime Minister and the former Attorney General, because that waiver was cut off when the former Attorney General left her time as Attorney General and moved to Veterans Affairs. And as you know, she resigned from Veterans Affairs after that. But miraculously, it would appear that the concept of cabinet confidence doesn't apply to the Prime Minister, much like every other rule seems to not apply to the Prime Minister, quite frankly, because in his complete access he gave to this writer, Aaron Wary, was to detail the meeting that he had with Jody Wilson-Raybould post her time becoming the Minister of Veterans Affairs. He's waiving cabinet confidence to a reporter in order to get his side out in a novel. And yet, the Ethics Commissioner cannot receive this information. Jody Wilson-Raybould says there is information. Jane Philpott says there is information that is of interest to Canadians. So I would like to ask the Ethics Commissioner whether or not he has taken any legal advice as to whether or not there has been a waiver of this cabinet confidence by the Prime Minister himself to cover a period of time that is currently not, and extend it over the period of time that would be of great interest to Canadians. And that would be something that I think that would be of great interest to Canadians, and I also believe that it is something that goes to the heart of ensuring that we get to the bottom of the matter. And picking up on what Elizabeth May said just a few minutes ago, this is the kind of scandal and the kind of actions that warrant the highest level of punishment. We can't force that, but it can be at the discretion. And clearly, as she said, it's not going to be happening. But we still owe it to Canadians to understand and give them the truthful information, what has happened, and not just take the word of the Prime Minister, because we have seen over and over again, the Prime Minister simply does not keep his word. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raitt. Next up, Mr. McKinnon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous apprécions tous le travail, évidemment, que fait le commissaire à l'éthique et au conflit d'intérêts et son bureau au soutien de tous les députés et de ce Parlement. Et dans ce cas-ci, dans le cas du présent rapport, le Premier ministre a remercié le commissaire, a accepté son rapport. Ce dossier a été étudié de manière exhaustive. Le Comité de la justice, comme on l'a entendu, a tenu plus de 13 heures de témoignages de la part de 10 témoins différents pendant 5 semaines. De plus, nous avons maintenant un rapport détaillé de 63 pages de la part du commissaire qui fait suite à des mois de travail de sa part. Le Premier ministre a également été sans équivoque en ce qui a trait au fait qu'il se concentrait uniquement pour protéger les emplois de milliers de travailleurs canadiens, et ce, en tout temps. Je pense que c'est ce que tout travailleur, tout Canadien qui a un emploi, pour qui leur emploi est en danger, s'attendrait. Maintenant, nous avons aussi un guide de la part de Anne McClellan, qui a parlé à tous les anciens procureurs généraux, qui aide à clarifier les relations entre...
Mr. McKinnon, we have a point of order. Go ahead, Mr. Angus.
Yes, the Justice Committee shut down their study. If they want to have Anne McClellan, they can go back to the Justice Committee. This is about the Ethics Committee. So to be bringing Anne McClellan, a former Liberal, report in, go back to the Justice Committee, which you shut down. This is about the Ethics Committee and Mr. Dion's report.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. It's not really a point of order, but Mr. McKinnon, proceed.
Je reprends ma phrase, Monsieur le Président. Nous avons aussi un guide de la part de Anne McClellan, qui a parlé à tous les anciens procureurs généraux et qui aide à clarifier les relations entre les procureurs généraux et leurs collègues au sein du cabinet. Le Premier ministre s'est déjà engagé devant tous les Canadiens à mettre en place, à implanter ces recommandations. Les processus combinés du Comité de la justice et du commissaire, pendant des mois, des heures, des pages, ont été minutieux et approfondis. Et c'est maintenant évident, après les discours de mes honorables collègues, que le véritable objectif de l'opposition est simplement de jouer de la politique. So we're all thankful for the work the Commissioner and his office do to support all members of the House and at all times. The Commissioner's report is quite detailed, and Canadians have had a good opportunity to familiarize themselves with the content. The Prime Minister has thanked the Commissioner and accepted the report. Though he disagrees with the conclusions, especially when so many jobs were at stake, and that is no laughing matter. He has already announced that steps would be taken to ensure no government goes through a similar situation in the future. This government, as should any government, takes seriously the responsibility of standing up for jobs and growing the economy. And it's the responsibility of any Prime Minister to stand up for people's jobs. In fact, it's the responsibility of all members of Parliament. And people whose jobs are on the line should expect no less of their elected
Point of
representatives.
order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Mr. Poilievre?
It is customary that when a member quotes a document in a committee that he or she table the document so that all members can see it. The member across the way claims to have an analysis from the government showing 9,000 jobs are at stake. Can he just table that so we can all have a look at that analysis? Thanks.
I would ask Mr. McKinnon, are you able to table that for the committee today?
No, that's not. Nor is that a point. Nor is that a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Nor is that a point of order, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
continue
but
on,
with
Mr. McKinnon.
that member and his rich experience in Canada's private sector, we'll have to look at his views with some skepticism too. It's the responsibility of any Prime Minister to stand up for people's jobs and livelihoods across the country, and it should be the job of all members of Parliament, while upholding, of course, at all times, the rule of law.
McKinnon, a point of order, Mr. Angus?
Yeah, this is all fine, but we are talking about a specific report. And the only job that is referenced at being risk is in the report where the Prime Minister said he was speaking as the MP of Papineau. So I would ask my colleague, since Mr. Murnau had no evidence of job loss, why he's making facts up now when we're talking about a factual finding of guilt against a Prime Minister who improperly used his position to further the interests of a very powerful corporation. That is the issue before us, not this spin of falsehood of jobs, because that was proven false by the Ethics Commissioner. So if the member has evidence that wasn't supplied to the Ethics Commissioner, perhaps it's one of the 9 witnesses that were not allowed to testify that knew all about these jobs, I'd ask him to put that on the table or spare us these liberal talking points that have been proven false and have continued the falsehoods by this Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. That's debate. We'll go back to Mr. McKinnon to finish your statement.
Mr. Chair, where I come from, we listen to folks and then we get to speak and we have a healthy exchange. I've been now interrupted 3 times by things that were not points of order, and I hope that the committee will indulge the rest of our statement. If
Mr.
out of
McKinnon,
collegiality
actually,
and politeness,
to be clear, the chair has the discretion to hear points of order and to hear
of course he
debate,
does. Yeah.
and has a responsibility to keep things in order.
I'm just expressing through you,
I
Mr.
expect
Chair,
as one of the
a hope for
visitors to our committee
politeness.
to just acknowledge the chair and his role in keeping things in order. Thank you,
Thank you, and I
McKinnon.
appreciate
Thank you.
your chairmanship today, Mr. Chair. The Prime Minister's objective throughout, as he stated, was to protect thousands of jobs in Canada, all the while ensuring the integrity and the independence of the justice system. As has been confirmed on multiple occasions, no direction was ever given to the Attorney General. Former Attorney General Anne McClellan also authored a report, having spoken with all former Attorneys General, as well as constitutional scholars, and offers recommendations, including a process and a set of principles by which to guide the relationship between the Attorney General and the government. Both the Prime Minister and the Attorney General have already stated that they will be looking at how to best implement those recommendations, such as the protocol on interactions with the Attorney General and better education for all parliamentarians on defining the role. Now, the matter before us today has been studied quite extensively. The Justice Committee held over 13 hours of comprehensive testimony from 10 different witnesses over a 5-week span. And we now have a very thorough 63-page report by the Commissioner. The opposition's claim to simply wanting the facts is contradicted by the fact that what they seek is found in the Commissioner's report. It is already public.
Sorry about that. I thought turned the audio back on, but I didn't.
So the only conclusion that I and members of this committee can come to is that the opposition seeks to prolong this process for reasons of policy.
I just realized I was on mute.
Partisan games, and it is for that reason, Mr. Chair, that we will be opposing this motion.
We'll go on next to Mr. Erskine Smith. Go ahead.
When I was first made vice chair of this committee, I don't think anyone realized how popular we'd be, so welcome everyone. 2 points of clarification first. So when Ms. Ray talks about procedural fairness, of course a decision maker owes procedural fairness to the subject of an investigation. It's not the other way around. And two, to silencing Ms. Wilson-Raybould, I watched hours of testimony before the Justice Committee. I read 43 some odd pages of testimony in which at the very end she said she had nothing more to add a formal process. So I think just 2 points of clarification. I'm not going to support this motion because of any. Sheer was in the riding yesterday, and so I just want to be clear. I'm also not supporting this motion because of any purported grassroots conservative campaign. I got 10 emails from my riding. It's not. That's not what motivated me. I will be supporting this motion though, to invite the commissioner to discuss his report. 1, in the interest of transparency and accountability, and 2, because in my own considered view, I think the ethics commissioner's conclusions are actually legally flawed in many respects.
I'm actually
asking some
shocked.
questions about his legal mistakes. So I've given a lot of thought to what happened. I've read what feels like a never-ending set of materials and coverage. And in the interest of making probably nobody happy, I want to share a few of my own conclusions, a number of which I've shared publicly before. So first and generally, I think it is both true at the same time that the then Attorney General did not exercise sufficient due diligence on the file, but it's also true at the same time that the PMO exerted pressure that should not have been exerted. The Shawcross Doctrine states that an Attorney General may but is not obliged to consult with colleagues in the government, and indeed it would be in some cases a mistake not to consult. A 2014 General Directive states it is quite appropriate for the Attorney General to consult with Cabinet colleagues before exercising his or her powers under the DPP Act in respect of criminal proceedings. Indeed, sometimes it will be important to do so to be cognizant of pan-government perspectives. Now, McClellan's report's also clear in examining the evidence that the Attorney General could have engaged in conversations with the DPP, which she suggested she could not have, could have asked for more information and solicited a second opinion. Now, to understand all public policy considerations here, and I take Ms. May's point that there was not a sufficient economic impact analysis, I'll tell you, if Ms. May or I were, or perhaps Mr. Kent were the Attorney General, the right course of action would have been to request an economic impact analysis from the Finance Minister or a third party when you've got a Section 13 notice, public interest notice from your DPP. And while Commissioner Dion was right that these considerations should not bear on his strict analysis under the Act, they do color the overall situation, and the Deputy Minister's comments in testimony to Dion raise the same concerns for me. At the same time, Dion's report and its factual findings make clear that the PMO exerted pressure that should not have been exerted. The Shawcross Doctrine is clear that the government is not to pressure the Attorney General at all for any reason. And McClellan's recommendations to establish new protocols for existing standards are themselves an acknowledgement that what took place should not have taken place. It is important that the Prime Minister has acknowledged mistakes were made, and I trust that McClellan's recommendations will be implemented. Third, and I know my Conservative colleagues, perhaps all colleagues on the other side will disagree with me, but I personally, having thought about this a lot, I think that the reaction and outrage to this situation has been disproportionate to these original mistakes of improper pressure, and I'll give 3 reasons. One, in my view, a DPA should have been more seriously considered. Organizations are made up of good people and bad people. When bad people do bad things in those organizations, they should be held criminally responsible to the fullest extent of the law. But the good people in those organizations, so long as the organization has reformed their practices, those good people, the employees, the innocent employees, should not suffer as a result. 2, given that this was a new law and that the Attorney General has never intervened under the DPP Act, a second opinion from Chief Justice McLaughlin, former Chief Justice McLaughlin, makes sense to me. I disagree with Dion's finding that there was any tantamount direction, but from what I read from his report, I can see, in fact, how there were repeated efforts to ask for a second opinion and improper repeated efforts to ask for a second opinion. Where I disagreed in reading his report, I could see no evidence that the analysis or advice of Chief Justice McLaughlin was in any way predetermined. And he made that factual finding, which I think is an incorrect factual finding. A second opinion from a respected jurist in this situation, I think, would have been reasonable. And lastly, in the end, there would have always been a great deal of transparency, even if the Attorney General had succumbed to that improper pressure and changed her mind. McClellan notes that with the creation of the DPP in 2006, one of the very few things I will say the former Conservative government did well, but the creation of that DPP in 2006, the federal justice system has now undergone the most significant organizational change in the last half century, according to McClellan, and any decision by the Attorney General to intervene must be in writing and public. And again, McClellan notes that its use would bring a high degree of public and political scrutiny. Lastly, and related, I do not accept Dion's findings that there was a conflict of interest. In my view, that conclusion is legally incorrect, and Mr. Weir, you've highlighted some of the reasons why. The Prime Minister and his staff were, and you can read Dion's report on multiple occasions, they are referencing jobs, and we can question the evidentiary foundations of their intentions, but their intentions, the conversations with Jerry Butts, the conversations with the staffers, Mr. Trudeau himself are saying we care about protecting jobs, and Dion documents multiple instances of this. So they were standing up for jobs, albeit mistakes in doing so, but in my opinion, having read the evidence, they were standing up in the public interest. At no time were they improperly furthering a private interest under the Act. There was a breach of Shawcross, but not a conflict of interest. A conflict would occur if, as a public office holder, I furthered a family member's interest, I furthered a friend's interest, my own interest, or as any basic statutory interpretation where we read the Act consistently with reference to other parts of the Act and the purpose of the Act, we would find that basket clause that one ought not to improperly further a similar interest. Conflicts are inherent. They demand recusal. They are unchanged, actually, by proper or improper pressure. Making mistakes to stand up for the public interest is not a conflict, though it was a breach of the Shawcross Doctrine. The Commissioner's analysis and conclusions are, in my own view, legally wrong on this point. Now, to the extent that partisan considerations, because those are mentioned on 4 occasions in the report, were brought to bear, first, no one should have brought these concerns, and in fact, McClellan's protocol would prevent any politically exempt staff from participating in any conversations going forward. Now, of course, Mr. Trudeau said I'm the member from Papineau. His own evidence to the Commissioner was anchored in his experience with his constituents and his understanding of the negative consequences of layoffs for communities. And I'll tell you, if Andrew Scheer is elected and stands up for dairy farmers, or I continue to stand up for animals, or if the member from Oshawa had said, you know what, I'm the member for Oshawa and I'm concerned about the GM plant closing, or I say to Bill Blair, I'm the member from Beaches East York and you're damn right, we have to do something about gun violence, it's not so clear that these are always partisan considerations. As McClellan cites one respected scholar, in many instances, and I think we can all, as partisan politicians, acknowledge this, in many instances, the approach that is taken may benefit the public while also serving partisan interests. And lastly, public opinion will be the final arbiter of whether the primary motivation is nonpartisan, and yes, motivations do matter. In my view, the primary motivation in this instance was to protect the public interest in jobs. The public interest was pursued improperly, but at no time did the Prime Minister improperly further a private interest. The Commissioner is legally wrong, and I would like him to sit right there so he could answer questions about how he got this analysis so completely wrong.
I am shocked right now that this guy supported the motion.
Go ahead, Mr.
I thought he was a nice guy.
For 4 years. He's very complex. I just need to hear, did he say he was voting against or voting for to have Mr. Dion speak to our committee? That's I just need to clarify that.
I'm voting for bringing Dion to this committee.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. For
I had to read Twitter to make sure.
You have a speakers list again, so we have Mr. Polyev. Go ahead.
This is big news.
Mr. Erskine Smith for his intervention, and he claims that the Prime Minister was acting in the public and not the private interest. Of course, the Ethics Commissioner finds exactly the opposite. He finds that the Prime Minister was acting in the private interest of SNC-Lavalin, and improperly so, thus the guilty finding under Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Act. Yet, Mr. Erskine Smith goes on repeating what he admits he has no proof to state, which is that this was about jobs. I reiterate that the top 4 players in the Prime Minister's team who tried to get a special deal for SNC-Lavalin admit They have no evidence that jobs would be lost. The Prime Minister admitted it during a press conference. His top bureaucrat admitted it before committee. His top advisor, Gerald Butts, admitted it before committee. And his finance minister admitted it right to the ethics commissioner's face. Again, I will read it, the quote, paragraph 126. When asked if Mr. Morneau or his office had undertaken a study or analysis of the economic impacts of the Director of Public Prosecution's decision, Mr. Morneau testified that none had been conducted. And we know why, because they would not have got the answer they were looking for. SNC-Lavalin's work is rooted in construction. Construction typically has to be done on site, and therefore the jobs associated with that construction could not simply vanish into thin air. The headquarters is bound to stay here until 2024, and the company just signed a multi-decade lease on that headquarters in the city of Montreal. And as for this excuse that SNC would be banned from federal contracts and therefore all kinds of jobs would be lost, well, one, obviously those contracts would go to companies that also employ Canadians, but two, that ban on bidding for federal contracts is a cabinet policy. If the Prime Minister simply wanted to preserve SNC's ability to bid on federal work after conviction, he could have allowed them to do so. He could simply have changed that policy to give the company an exemption and allow it to continue to bid on federal work. So Mr. McKinnon and Mr. Erskine-Smith both admit that they have no evidence whatsoever to substantiate the jobs claim, and the jobs claim is Mr. Erskine-Smith's purported public interest. But there is no evidence to support that public interest actually existed, then there must have been a private interest at work. So what motivated it? Well, let me quote a recent story from the Globe and Mail on this subject. Mario Dion, the federal ethics watchdog, laid bare the all-too-cozy underside of corporate Canada in finding the Prime Minister and his team violated the Conflict of Interest Act by relentlessly pushing former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould to drop a criminal case against SNC-Lavalin. By naming names and detailing exactly what played out behind closed doors last fall, Mr. Dion showed how top executives at one of the country's largest banks came into to feature prominently in this political drama. Mr. Dion's report details the role that the Bank of Montreal board chairman Robert Pritchard and BMO vice chairman Kevin Lynch played in lobbying the Trudeau Liberals on behalf of SNC-Lavalin, including multiple pitches the pair made to former president of the Treasury Board, Scott Bryson, last October and November. Here's where things get far too cute. Mr. Bryson stepped down as cabinet minister early this year to become vice chair of the investment banking arm of, you guessed it, Bank of Montreal. According to Mr. Dion, Mr. Pritchard and Lynch first reached out to Mr. Bryson in mid-October on an unrelated matter, then used the conversation to persuade the politician to give SNC-Lavalin a remediation agreement. Mr. Bryson later told the ethics commissioner that, quote, the company's concerns appeared sensible, and he contacted Ms. Wilson-Raybould the same day to bring the company's concerns to her attention. And Ms. Wilson-Raybould said something to the effect of, the lady's not for turning, explaining she could not interfere in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. And so, here we have just one instance. The chairman and the vice chairman of one of Canada's most powerful banks, who also happen to be linked to SNC-Lavalin, asked the Treasury Board president to help the company get a deal. The same day, he calls the Attorney General and carries out their request. And what do you know? A few months later, he's all of a sudden vice chairman of that at that same bank. So the members across expect us just to believe blindly that the Prime Minister was just waging a war in favor of the public interest when he relentlessly hounded his attorney general to interrupt the prosecution of the company. But I have just one example here of where there were clearly private interests at stake. Clearly, cozy relationships between extremely powerful people, back-scratching, reciprocal back-scratching. And we want to know, given that this whole jobs excuse has been debunked and that the government, including Mr. McKinnon, admit there's no evidence for it, what was the real motivation here? Why did the Prime Minister go to such lengths to protect this company? And if there are more stories like this one, where top bankers go to a cabinet minister, he jumps as soon as they ask him to, and then gets a job at that bank 4 or 5 months later, then this government has a lot more to answer for. And if it's not afraid of the truth, all the members on the other side will vote to let us see that truth.
Thank you again, Mr. Polyev. Next up, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I left home at 5 a.m. yesterday morning to catch my flight here. Ms. May, I think, comes from a little further west than Thunder Bay. I know you come from someplace out in the far west. This has been a fascinating discussion, but it has taken 81 minutes of our meeting. I am here to hear from Mr. Dion, and I think we have good arguments. If Mr. Erskine-Smith puts his arguments, I'd rather him put it to Mr. Dion than to me. And I would rather Mr. Polyev put his questions to Mr. Dion than to the Liberals. So I would ask that we get down to the business at hand and have Mr. Dion speak, because we're running out of time.
Okay, Mr. Angus, I have 2 more speakers. We have Mr. Kent and then Ms. Raitt.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I agree fully with my colleague, Mr. Angus, and I thank all of the guests here today, with the exception of Mr. McKinnon. Mr. McKinnon comes to us as a stranger to this committee, unaware of the practices and precedents of this committee, and the fact that officers of Parliament report to this committee and have regularly reported to committee after the filing of reports. I appreciate Mr. Erskine-Smith's defiance of the direction, I'm sure, from the PMO, asking for lockstep support of Mr. McKinnon, knowing that he has made his point, a principled point that has been made before several times this year. Mr. Erskine-Smith has said, for example, that the real question is the nature of the intervention to the former Attorney General. And he said on the record, this is impossible to answer without giving the former Attorney General an opportunity to speak. She has asked for that opportunity, and it should be provided to her without limitation. That has been denied. That is a key part of the Ethics Commissioner's report. And I would suggest to the other 3 regular members of this committee that they, in fact, ignore the direction that Mr. McKinnon is trying to lead them, or at least speak to this committee and tell us how you could possibly support his defiance of the precedent of hearing from the Commissioner, as we did following the equally unacceptable report regarding the Prime Minister in his acceptance of the illegal vacation last January 10th.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. And it's just been signaled that the speaker that was going to speak isn't, so we can go to the vote on the motion.
A recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote. Yes. That given the unprecedented nature of the Trudeau II report, the committee invite the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner to brief the committee on his report, and that the committee invite any further witnesses as required based on the testimony of the Commissioner. So we'll call the vote. Go ahead, Mr. Clerk.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Can you just indicate who has the right to vote in this particular proceeding? I know there are a lot of members here.
Thank you for bringing that up, Mr. Polyev. I think everyone that we'll actually list the names here. So go ahead, Mr. Clerk, if you want to list them out, just for Mr. Polyev's question.
Just for clarity's sake, Ms. Raitt, Mr. Kent, Mr. Angus, and we have Mr. Bayless, Mrs. McCrimmon, Ms. Vanderbilt, Madame Fortier, Mr. McKinnon, and Mr. Erskine-Smith.
And myself, if there's a tie. So if is that clear, Mr. Polyev? Okay, so we're good to go ahead and proceed with the vote. Go ahead, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Kent?
Yes.
Ms. Raitt?
Yes.
Mr. Angus? Mr. Erskine-Smith? Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Very firm.
Madame Fortier?
No.
Ms. Vanderbilt?
No.
Ms. McCrimmon?
No.
Mr. Bayless?
No.
Think they'll all be held accountable in the election.
Motion is defeated.
Put your comments in the comment field.
Go ahead, Mr. Angus.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to get it on the record so we could stop beating around the bush, because we know with the appearance of our friend who's the former head of the Liberal Party showing up for the first time in 4 years at our committee, that this was going to be a whip vote and they were going to let our friend Erskine-Smith off the hook because they're from Beaches and hey, he's a nice guy. So they did the math, and so, you know, he had to explain why he was more than willing to shadow box with the ethics commissioner. So I'm glad at least we have it clear now. So I'd like to bring my motion forward, because there's a number of witnesses I think need to be heard. Do you want
Pierre
me to
Pulliver's pretty happy.
Go ahead, Mr. Angus. please.
Thank God for telephones, eh?
I can read it, or you
Back
can
in
read
the
it.
old
I'm
days,
sure you
man, when
can-
you used to try and read your motion on a phone, it just, that the committee invite the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion to present his findings to the Trudeau 2 report. I think that has already been cancelled out, but that the committee invite Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Minister of Finance Bill Morneau, the senior advisor to the Prime Minister and former Chief of Staff to the Minister of Finance, Ben Chin, on account of their intimate connection to the matters at the heart of the report. And that the committee invite the Clerk of the Privy Council to appear to explain his decision not to share critical cabinet confidences with the Commissioner, who felt that his investigation was hampered by the refusal. So why is this important? Because we saw throughout the this whole scandal that the Liberals shut down the Justice Committee, did not hear from other witnesses. They shut down the Ethics Committee, and the Prime Minister stood in the House day after day and stated that they were going to work and trust the Ethics Commissioner. What we've learned from this report is very disturbing, because we actually now know that this plan to tailor-make a law. Now, Mr. Erskine-Smith's a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. But I don't know, you know, from watching all my law shows on TV, can you, like, write your own laws if you're the defendant? Well, apparently, if you're really powerful, yes, you can. And who fixes it for you? It's, according to Mr. Dion's evidence that he brings forward, that very, very early on in the new government, the Prime Minister meets with the CEO of SNC Lavalin, and they discuss writing a law to get them a get-out-of-jail card. So it's the Prime Minister who begins the direction. That's one of the reasons we need to hear from Prime Minister Trudeau. And why is that important? Because, you know, the Liberal line out there is like, hey, hasn't hurt us in the polls, so who cares? Well, I hear from people all the time about this. People who are appalled that a Prime Minister could break his word so easily to Canadians. A Prime Minister who said he was going to be open and transparent. I think of the promise that the Prime Minister made to the people of Grassy Narrows. I've been in Grassy Narrows. I've seen children suffering from Minamata disease. And I saw the Prime Minister say, we will clean that up once and for all. And he did squat. No, actually, he did something. He made fun of Grassy Narrows at a gathering of his rich, elite friends. Now, if only Grassy Narrows had lobbyists that could say, hey, we want this fixed. How much would fixing the health center at Grassy Narrows cost a government this powerful? Well, it's chump change, it's peanuts. And in 4 years, he couldn't move to help children suffering from mercury contamination. But when the CEO of SNC Lavalin says, hey, we want to get out of jail card, the Liberals over there have the gall to tell us that he only ever cared about the public interest, that he only cared about jobs, that there was 9,000 jobs at stake. And yet we look at the report, because one would think that it was the responsibility of the finance minister of this country, Bill Morneau, you know, from the famous Morneau-Chappelle. If they were caring about jobs, they would have cared about Sears workers, but no. Sears workers are now being looked after by the family company, Morneau-Chappelle.
I forget
So
about that.
9,000 jobs. You would have thought they would have done due diligence, and this is what shocked me. I mean, I guess Bill Morneau, I thought, okay, the guy wears, you know, very expensive suits and that, but surely to God he knows how to run a business. If he's really concerned about 9,000 jobs, they wouldn't pull that number out of thin air. And yet the report shows that they had done nothing to prove this. And my colleagues in the Liberals say it's actually the role of the Justice Department. It should have been Jody Wilson-Raybould who undertook an assessment of the impacts of the crime. Now, again, I didn't go to law school. So when you're the defendant, do you expect the prosecutor to have the responsibility to figure out what is it going to cost if you get charged and convicted? Like, what's the cost to the economy? Say you're a businessman and you're a corrupt businessman. Is it the responsibility of the Attorney General to do a cost analysis? Well, I guess only if you're that powerful that you can have the law written for you. So let's just go through some of these questions that were really concerning. Why do we need Bill Morneau here? Now, I know I've been sort of picking on Bill, but what really shocks me is that Bill Morneau flies to Davos, Switzerland to meet with the head of SNC-Lavalin. A week after the so-called public consultation period on the SNC deferred prosecution agreement, the specific get-out-of-jail card is given. And Bill Morneau tells the ethics commissioner he doesn't remember what they talked about. He doesn't remember that he flew to Davos, Switzerland to see the head of SNC-Lavalin and doesn't remember what they talked about, because that's a month before this get-out-of-jail card was slipped into an omnibus piece of legislation. And Bill Morneau doesn't remember that? Because this is what we're talking about here, is the fact that they were able to write a law, specific law, to help SNC in a specific case to get off its charges. Now, once this law was put in, we learned from this report that Ms. Wilson-Raybould was very concerned, as the Attorney General, that this law had been rushed because it was a law for one company, for one case. And she tried to distance herself from it. Why? Because she felt it would compromise her. I would love to have heard from Mr. Dion about this, but obviously we're not going to be allowed. But the fact that the Attorney General had raised concerns that a law was being implemented without proper due regard for the fact that a law must represent the interests of all Canadians. It cannot be written tailor-made for the defendant. So Mr. Morneau, again, appears to interfere in this process when Ben Chin starts calling into the Attorney General's office, and Ben Chin says the company, their perception was the process of negotiating a remediation agreement was taking too long. Oh my God, it must be really hard to be that powerful, to be able to write your own laws and then to say, hey, how come we're not off the hook yet? So they phone in to the Attorney General's office to say, speed it up. And Jessica Prince responds to Ben Chin that you are really close to being far over the line on the improper interference in the independence of the judiciary. And that report is made available to Bill Morneau. And Bill Morneau tells the ethics commissioner he doesn't remember seeing it. I mean, poor Bill. How could you have such a dodgy memory if you have to have so many facts and numbers and jobs? You can't remember that you've been told by your chief of staff that you're improperly interfering in an independent prosecution investigation. And you know, when you speak to the ethics commissioner, you are on oath. So is Bill Morneau truthful that he doesn't remember the key meeting in Davos, Switzerland, doesn't remember what they talked about, that he doesn't remember receiving that email from his chief of staff that he was improperly advising? I can't believe that Bill Morneau didn't know that this concern had been raised. I would like to ask Bill Morneau why he told the ethics commissioner he never read it. Because it either says it says one of two things. Either Mr. Morneau is incompetent or Mr. Morneau is not telling the truth to the ethics commissioner. And each of those are very troubling. So we know that the Liberals have told us that they got a report from Anne McClellan and everything would be rosy if we just followed that. Well, everything would be rosy as is, because you don't have to change the rules to stop interference in the independent prosecution. You just have to respect the rules. That's what Liberals don't understand. Justin Trudeau doesn't believe the law of the land applies to him. We don't need a new report to say anything about the independence of the prosecutorial system in our country. It is established. It is based on a principle, and that principle is that you don't cross that line. Yet I'm amazed at how many people were involved in this. This is where Ben Chin needs to talk. What in God's name was Ben Chin calling into the Attorney General's office, demanding that they start to move quicker on getting their pals at SNC-Lavalin off the hook? Who gave him that authority? Because they were discussing this agreement with industry, the Treasury Board, procurement, and not once with the Attorney General's office. So when Ms. Wilson-Raybould read the report and said she was very surprised at the extent of the interference, there was a whole pattern of everybody, it was all hands on deck in the Liberal Party. They all knew, they were all involved, and they were all breaking the law of Canada because Justin Trudeau told them to break the law, because Justin Trudeau said, hey, I'm the MP for Papineau, and there's going to be an election soon. And Bouchard said, yeah, laws are great, but we got to get reelected. So we have my Liberal colleagues putting the falsehood out that he was concerned about jobs. And I think Mr. Erskine-Smith, who I have great respect for, I don't like his shoes, but everything else I've got great respect for. I think he just told us that it was perfectly okay for the MP for Papineau to stand up for his region, just like he would stand up for issues in his region, just like I stand up for jobs in my region. The difference is that I am a member, as a single member of Parliament, a backbencher. I am not the Prime Minister of this country. So I can stand up and say, hey, I need to help jobs in my riding. That's part of my job. That's part of Mr. Erskine-Smith's job. But the Prime Minister can't say, I got an election up ahead and I got to get reelected and you got to rewrite me a law. Because correct me if I'm wrong, when Jim Flaherty was the finance minister, I think I was one who went after him over the fact that he had written a letter in support of a business while he was finance minister. And Mr. Flaherty said, I was acting as a local MP. That's my job. And they ruled you cannot, as the finance minister, do that because you have so much extra power, a power that Mr. Erskine-Smith or Madame Fortier or I don't have. That's the difference. That's where the Conflict of Interest Act is based, is that the higher up you are in terms of political power, the more responsibilities. So when Justin Trudeau says, I am the MP for Papineau, I got to defend my patch, he was already breaking the Conflict of Interest Act, and he was furthering someone else's interests. And having been on this committee for a number of years, I note Mr. Erskine-Smith's belief that you can only claim that financial interest is a personal financial interest, that if someone gives you money, therefore you are advancing their interests. And this has been a long-standing debate in terms of the role of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, whether or not what defines interest. Because Mary Dawson, our previous one, was much more vague about this, and certainly, issues of people paying money into your riding association, she was saying, well, is that direct or is it indirect? Mr. Dion has given us a ruling, and that ruling is that he was furthering the financial interest of SNC-Lavalin, not furthering the interests of thousands of jobs, not furthering the interests of the Canadian people. And if the Liberals believe he's wrong, they would have let him speak, but they're not letting him speak. They've shut him down. They have shut down our committee. They've obstructed the work of our committee. So we have to go to other witnesses, which is another reason why Mr. Trudeau is very, very essential to this. Because one of the most staggering statements that I found in Mr. Dion's report is that we have an SNC lawyer, Mr. Pritchard, talking to the former president of the Treasury Board about the case that Ms. Wilson-Raybould is overseeing. And Mr. Pritchard for SNC states, quote, "We are considering other ways to make it easier for the minister to engage and reverse the DPP's decision. In the end, however, that will take a deliberate decision from the center." That there, my friends, is collusion. That there is conspiracy. And that there is the lawyer for SNC Lavalin phoning the head of the Treasury Board and saying we are going to corrupt the decision of the Attorney General and we are going to, quote, make it easy for them to overturn this. But it's going to come from the center. So who is the center? The center is the Prime Minister of this country, Justin Trudeau, who in that moment is involved in the collusion and conspiracy to undermine the rule of law in this country. That's why the Liberals voted against Mr. Dion presenting his report, because once that's on the record, all other questions become much, much less important. And then out of this is that Ms. Wilson-Raybould seems to have done her job. She was told that it would be extraordinary, unprecedented for her to bring other people in. And the idea that Beverly Ann McLaughlin should have been brought in, this was cooked up by SNC's lawyer, who's a former Supreme Court justice, who then reached out to another former Supreme Court justice to get an opinion. And in Canada, we trust the independence of the Supreme Court. We believe these people are representing our interests. But when you're SNC Lavalin, you can hire someone from the Supreme Court and he'll phone one of his buddies on the Supreme Court and they'll get you a tailor-made opinion. And then they'll go to Beverly Ann McLaughlin. Did anyone tell Beverly Ann McLaughlin, listen, Jody Wilson's not playing ball here. We need you to give us something so we can go and put pressure on her. And as they said, this lady was not one for turning. She did not give into it because she was concerned from knowing that that law had been written specifically for SNC, that if she acted, it would have compromised her role as the Attorney General of this country. That was what she said. Which leads me to the other reason we actually need to hear from Justin Trudeau. It states in the report by Mr. Dion that when Mr. Trudeau was thwarted in his attempt, that he set out to discredit, professionally discredit the Attorney General of Canada. And we know from seeing when this came public, there was one story leaked after another from the Liberal war machine that painted Miss Wilson-Raybould as troublesome, that what they say that, oh, she was taking her orders from her father, what a diminution of the role of a woman Attorney General, that there was one attack after another until they actually lined up a whole bunch of the Liberal caucus to go out to the cameras and trash Jody Wilson's reputation, to blame her, that she was the troublemaker. She didn't play well with others. She wasn't good enough to, she wouldn't go along. And, you know, the Prime Minister said, you know, that it's really important to have, to be open and to be feminist, but you gotta play ball. And she didn't play ball. And it says here that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau attempted to discredit her. I think that that's staggering. That if you're standing up for the rule of law in this country and they will orchestrate a campaign to trash your reputation, that needs accountability. I would have preferred to ask Mr. Dion directly because Mr. Dion is not making these statements out of thin air. He's making it on the evidence he found. And we don't have access to hear Mr. Dion speak because the Liberals are obstructing this, just as they've obstructed everything, which is what's gotten him into trouble. But we could ask Mr. Trudeau. So finally, Mr. Chair, I want to just end on the issue of obstruction, which we've seen today, which has been the pattern, which everybody in the media said was going to happen because you can see the pattern of obstruction. But what's very shocking is that 9 witnesses were blocked from giving testimony. 9 witnesses were denied an access to speak to the Ethics Commissioner. The Ethics Commissioner should have been allowed to come to our committee because our job is we're the oversight committee for the Ethics Commissioner. If someone's interfering with the work of an ethics investigation, that needs to be reported to Parliament. But the problem is that it's the Prime Minister of the country's being investigated. And as I said earlier, the principle of the Conflict of Interest Act and the code and the lobbying code is that the more powerful you are, the higher your standard of ethical accountability must be. You can be a newbie MP and you can make a mistake and you can get into trouble, but there's a difference when you're the Prime Minister of this country. And why did they interfere? Well, they claimed cabinet confidence. Well, obviously cabinet confidence didn't mean all that much when Jody Wilson-Raybould was meeting Jerry Butts and SNC was pretty much sitting under the table listening in. They didn't seem to think cabinet confidence meant diddly squat then. But they've silenced Ms. Wilson-Raybould. They've silenced Jane Philpott's ability to speak. They've attempted to use cabinet confidence to interfere with the work of the Ethics Commissioner. If this stands, then what the Prime Minister's office is saying is that I am above the law of the land, because the only law that applies to the Prime Minister is the Conflict of Interest Act. And if you're going to use the power of the Prime Minister's office to forbid the Ethics Commissioner from gathering evidence, then he can't do his job. So we need to find out. And so I would like to ask Justin Trudeau, what did he mean when he said, well, we don't want to create any, quote, troublesome precedents? Well, yeah, I bet. When you're under investigation, it's troublesome. You know? It's the same as like when you're the defendant. The defendant, and my colleague, Mr. Erskine-Smith, can correct me if I'm wrong, because I did not go to law school. Generally, my understanding is the defendant doesn't get to write the law, right? The defendant doesn't get to call in to the prosecutor's office and say, hey, speed it up, get me off the hook, I'm important. That's not how it works. So SNC, as the defendant, should not be allowed to write their own laws. And the Prime Minister, as the person under investigation, does not have the right and should not have the right of obstructing the investigation because he finds it troublesome. So since they're so concerned about Mr. Dion being able to testify of what he found, I would say, if we're not allowed to hear from the commissioner who reports to our committee and we're being obstructed on this, then the reasonable thing would be to have Mr. Chin come, because he got promoted, didn't he? For all his interference in the independence of the prosecution, he got promoted. Jerry Butts is back on the campaign bus, so obviously they're all laughing and slapping each other on the back because breaking laws is what Liberals are doing and they're getting away with it. The Prime Minister needs to come because he's the one who said, yeah, thanks for the report of finding me guilty, but whatever. I'm carrying on. And Bill Morneau, the man with the amazing disappearing memory. Now, just finally on that, I do remember that Bill Morneau forgot that he owned a villa in the south of France. So I guess it's possible. I mean, you know, who among us have not forgotten that we own a villa in the house south of France? Frank, I know a couple of times you just dropped and you never even mentioned it, and then it was like, oh yeah, geez, I can't remember where I put my keys. So maybe he flew to Davos to meet with the head of SNC-Lavalin just prior to this omnibus legislation, and maybe he forgot. But maybe he didn't, and that's why Mr. Morneau needs to come and testify before our committee.
Thank you, Mr. Angus, as always. Next up, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
So this is not a comment, Charlie, on that I think Peter Kent is more reasonable than you all of the time. But in this instance, while his motion...
Point of clarification, he just attacked me. Can you tell him to stop?
Mr. Kent's motion was I think, a reasonable one. I think this particular motion is an overreach. It's inconsistent with the past practice of this committee, and it is effectively, I mean, I'm repeating myself from previous occasions, but we are not an investigatory body, and it is treating us as one. So I will be voting against the motion. I was happy to support Mr. Kent's to invite Mr. Dion, but inviting an endless stream of witnesses, I mean, it's not something I can support.
How are Canadians going to get answers?
Smith, next up, Ms. May.
Or not?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. And I'm not a voting member at this table, of course, but in response to some of the points put forward by my colleagues, first of all, and it's a really hard issue for all of us here around the table, but I have to say that I found, sort of following on to your point, Mr. Erskine-Smith, that I think it's unhelpful to describe this case as the Prime Minister telling people that he wants them to break the law. I maintain, for what it's worth, that I don't think to this day, which is also maybe equally troubling or more troubling, that the Prime Minister understands that what he did was wrong. And I think he's maintained that view because the people around him were overwhelmed by the fact that former Supreme Court judges were telling them what to do and undermining their Attorney General, who happened to be a younger woman and Indigenous. And this part of the story bothers me.
Stop
I
making
also want to
excuses.
say, to remind my friend, Mr. Erskine Smith, what should the former Attorney General have done, reminding you of her testimony to the Justice Committee. She said to those lobbying her on behalf of SNC-Lavalin, let them know that if they have additional evidence that goes to the decision maker, and the decision maker in this case is Kathleen Rizal, Director of Public Prosecutions. And our former Attorney General said on the evidence that she had said to those lobbying for SNC-Lavalin, if they have a representation on a threat to jobs and they send it to me, I will ensure that it is put before the Director of Public Prosecutions so she can take it into consideration. Such a letter was never sent. It's also disturbing to me that so many of the people, and I would like to have these people before the Ethics Committee, many of them in former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony, were given access by our former Attorney General to the Section 13 report, which is highly confidential, of the former Director of Public Prosecutions, and they declined to read it and seem to have lost it, including a number of political staff in PMO, the Deputy Minister to the Department of Justice herself, the former Clerk of Privy Council. And to Mr. Erskine Smith's point that a corporation can have good people and bad people, all true. But this corporation is charged in its corporate state. It is charged as a corporate person. There are no individual officers charged. The corporation must face full trial, which is why I go to just one last point, Mr. Chair. If we're looking for a real motive, we don't have to look far. Some of the most celebrated corporate giants of this country, businessmen with good reputations, people like Gwyn Morgan, former chair of Encana and major fossil fuel lobbyist against climate action, was chair of the board throughout all the time when the alleged bribery took place, and chair of the governance committee. There are a lot of people on the board of directors, I won't list them all, whose reputations could be hurt if what I suspect might be in the evidence to be heard in an open court is actually heard. Because this is not just bribery charges of a small nature. This is working hand in glove with the Gaddafi regime and paying millions of dollars. SNC-Lavalin, by the way, this whole idea that they've been washed pure as snow, they haven't changed their auditor. Deloitte's was their auditor then, Deloitte's is their auditor now, and somehow never noticed that $50 million went missing in bribes in Libya. I think that what we're looking at is corporate Canada exerting its influence to not have to face a full trial because reputations will be harmed. I think that's enough of a motive to start leaning on the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the President of Treasury Board, and all their friends. And we need to ensure that Canadians understand that this isn't about small things, and the Shawcross principle is a bridge too far for most Canadians to care about. And I accept that. I get that. But it's really important that Canadians know that no future government, no future Prime Minister should ever allow pressure to be brought to bear to stop a full and open trial of the alleged criminal activities of this corporation. And under the principles of deferred prosecution agreements, as understood in international law, economic disadvantage to the corporation is not a relevant factor. We need to understand that we should protect workers always, but we must not protect criminality because the people whose reputations could be hurt are powerful. You bet they're powerful. They've blocked climate action for quite a while. I'm afraid that this corporation needs to face a trial on the evidence that Kathleen Rizal, as Director of Public Prosecutions, decided under a Section 13 report disqualifies them from a deferred prosecution agreement by law. That's what our former Attorney General looked at. That's why she exercised her due diligence to ensure the decision by the public prosecutor, Director of Public Prosecutions, and I agree with Mr. Nathaniel Erskine Smith once again. This was a very good move that the former Conservative government brought in Director of Public Prosecutions and insulated that office from political interference. That's all quite right and good. And Canadians need to know this is about making sure a corporation charged with crimes we don't know, up to and including killing people, we don't know, Evidence is under the Section 13 report. We need to have it come before an open court. And that's why I think the pressure was brought to bear. Powerful men have powerful friends. And I still think that our Prime Minister needs to understand, and I don't think he does, that what he did was wrong. And he needs to apologize to Jane Philpott, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and the people of Canada.
Thank you, Ms. May. I have two more speakers. I have Mr. Kent and Ms. Ramsey. So if anybody else would wish to speak, we have about an hour and 7 minutes left. So I'll go ahead, Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair. And very briefly, I'd like to thank Mr. Erskine Smith for his vote in support of my motion earlier today, and I say that even as I intend to enthusiastically support Mr. Angus in his motion when it comes to a vote. I must say again, and this is a second chance for the other 4 Liberal members of this committee to stand up and do the job that they sit on this committee for, which is to defend the practices and protocols of this committee as we have practiced in the past, the precedents. It seems obvious that they are taking direction this afternoon, Mr. Erskine Smith aside, from a hitman from the PMO, a stranger to this committee who obviously thinks that the sorts of practices that are accepted in committees on which he has participated are acceptable here. They are not. So I would suggest again, this is a second chance for the 4 Liberals opposite to stand up, to comment, to justify the no vote that you cast in the first motion and the no vote that I understand you're going to cast in this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Ms. Ramsey.
I just want to pick up, I won't repeat a lot of the things that have been said. I do agree with many of them from my colleagues here. But I would like to talk a little bit about the importance of having Minister Morneau and Ben Chin appear before the committee. This is something that we attempted to do at the Justice Committee. Of course, we were unable to, and I really reject Mr. McKinnon's characterization of that those meetings as being comprehensive, or of us having, enough testimony at the Justice Committee. Nothing could be further from the truth. There were multiple attempts made to have many other people come before the committee because, quite frankly, we still only have a part of the story. And even I believe I heard Ms. Wilson-Raybould reference from the other side today saying that she had said that she didn't have anything else to say, and that's because it was within the scope of what she was allowed to say. She certainly has more to say, and I think that we all accept that now. I also would like to echo my colleague and say that the Prime Minister owes an apology to Ms. Wilson-Raybould, to Ms. Philpott, to Canadians. And the Prime Minister to have repeatedly stood up and say that somehow he never understood that there was some type of political interference. When we look at this report that we've received from the Ethics Commissioner, starting back in mid-August, we have Ben Chin going to Jessica Prince, and right away she says to him that this could be perceived and maybe improper political interference. So at the very beginning of this, there's someone who is laying out that this could be perceived as political interference. Now, I don't believe that Mr. Chin was operating on his own, behalf, that he just decided to go over to speak to the Attorney General's staff. I believe that was under the direction of the minister that he works for, Mr. Morneau. I would anticipate if we could hear from Mr. Chin, that would be one of the questions. What was the direction given to him in those conversations that happened with Jessica Prince? So, mid-August 2018, we already have 2 staff people who are having a conversation about potential political interference. Then we move on, and as we go throughout the story, again, we have in September 19th, Jody Wilson-Raybould goes to Mr. Morneau in the House, and she quite clearly tells him that his staff need to stop contacting her office on the matter and that they were undermining the fundamental tenets of democracy and prosecutorial independence. So again, here's Minister Morneau again involved in the story. Again, being told directly, we're talking about political interference. Are you telling me that the Minister of Finance, when being told by the Attorney General and Minister of Justice that he is potentially even touching that line, does not go and talk to the Prime Minister? This is what we need to know. We need to know and understand what was said at that cabinet table. Because clearly there are a lot of players, and potentially, they did notify the Prime Minister to say, listen, you're getting very close to something dangerous here. You have to stop what you're doing. Are you telling me that no one at that cabinet table, including Mr. Morneau, whose fingerprints of his staff and himself are all over this report that we've received, that he did not go and notify the Prime Minister that what he was doing was wrong? I cannot comprehend that happening. And for the Prime Minister to repeatedly stand up and say, I don't believe that I did this, I didn't know that that's, what would be interpreted by this, whatever it is that he's trying to say, quite frankly, it's incomprehensible to say that he accepts the report, he accepts some kind of responsibility, but he doesn't understand this, when clearly there were many, many people within the circle that were aware of this and had an obligation and a responsibility to go to the Prime Minister and tell him. And then we continue on, and you get down to even in November of 2018, November 20th, the PCO sends a memo telling him not to meet with Mr. Bruce or any representative from SNC to discuss the case in order to avoid the public perception of political interference. Again, he's notified. This time by the PCO. It appears as though there were people trying to inform him. I hope they were. That's their obligation, and they should be doing that. And he's ignoring that. And then there's another reference of it on November 22nd. So again, PMO staffers involved, Bouchard and Marquez. Are you telling me that they were all just out there operating independently and not reporting back to the Prime Minister, not reporting back to the Minister, and that the Minister of Finance isn't reporting back to the Prime Minister of Canada? These are some serious systemic problems. And I don't believe that, I know we don't have the answer, because now, we're not going to be able to have the Ethics Commissioner come before us. But I would implore that we listen and we hear from all of these players, and we need to hear from Minister Morneau. So I'll leave my comments at that, but I think there's such a strong argument, and I don't understand how the Minister of Finance in our country is pretending as though he doesn't remember, is, directing his staff to do things that they're apparently not telling him about or having conversations with him about. There are many questions, and I think it's one of the questions really that we have to the Ethics Commissioner would be, whether you think that Mr. Morneau acted improperly. And Canadians have a right to know, and this committee should pursue that effort. So I'll leave my comments at that.
Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. Next up, we have Mr. Angus.
Thank you. I want to address a few things. First, to remind my colleague, Mr. Erskine-Smith, that actually we are an investigative body here. We have subpoenaed evidence. We've issued summonses. We've seized documents.
Just wanted to put that up.
At this committee to
36% commented about 30.
The fundamental job that we have is to have the officers of Parliament report to us, and so today the Liberals voted not to allow the Ethics Commissioner to present his report. One of the other officers of Parliament that reports to us is the Lobbying Commissioner. We've had very little relationship with Madame Bélanger, the new Commissioner, but the previous Commissioner, Karen Shepherd, was an extraordinary force for accountability, and I'm hoping Ms. Bélanger will do the same thing. I have written to her because I'm very concerned, because you have, and this is something we've raised numerous times as the New Democratic Party, about the problem with the difference between the conflict of interest obligations and the Lobbying Act. How is it possible that the Prime Minister could be found privately furthering the interests of a corporation, and yet that corporation is not found to have improperly lobbied, or vice versa? We've had situations where the Lobbying Act has been ruled against individuals, lobbyists, but not against the public office holders. So I would really think it's important for Madame Bélanger to investigate, given that we have not been able to get answers from Mr. Dion because the Liberals have obstructed him speaking, but the pattern of intense lobbying that involved writing an actual law while they were the defendant is very concerning, because the Lobbying Act is clear. You cannot put a public office holder in a conflict of interest or in a compromised position. And that's what was being done, right down to this statement that they needed the power from the center to put that pressure on to force Madame Wilson-Raybould to change her mind. So the issue of lobbying, I think, is something we need to really deal with. I want to go to Ms. May's point about the international implications. I think this is very, very important, and I'm really glad that she framed it in this manner, because this idea that this was about Canadian jobs and Canadian pensions is ridiculous when we see a pattern of corruption and bribery charges that have been brought against SNC-Lavalin in jurisdiction after jurisdiction to be barred by the World Bank. You have to be pretty bad. Because we're dealing with a lot of jurisdictions where the rule of law is very tepid, to say the least. The allegations that have come out of Libya are shocking, and Canada has to have international credibility that we believe in the rule of law. And to that end, we now know that the OECD anti-bribery unit is putting the Trudeau government on watch, because they've seen how this government has attempted to shut down the SNC investigation. And I agree with Ms. May that what we're looking at here is not about the jobs of individual Canadians, because the construction work has to be done. They are bidding on projects that many companies are bidding on in Canada. But this is certainly going to be about some very, very powerful people who go back 20 years at least, very tied to both the Liberals and the previous Conservative government. Do I mention Arthur Porter here? I mean, here was a man that ended his days in a Panamanian jail. And he was given a position by former Prime Minister Harper to be overseeing CSIS. That's the power of these people. Arthur Porter's involvement with the McGill Hospital scandal, those court cases still have to come. But the international implications of Canada shutting down an investigation into one of their own companies who've been found to be involved in corruption and bribery internationally makes Canada a country that is not credible for the international rule of law. And that is what the OECD anti-bribery unit has announced, why they are investigating. So what we're witnessing today is the obstruction of a committee to forbid an officer of Parliament from doing his job, which is to report to a committee on a finding of guilt against the Prime Minister of Canada for furthering the interests of a corporation facing corruption and bribery charges, a company that has been barred around the world because of their repeated violations. These are very, very serious, and we can see the power that they have. It is the corrosive power of the 1% to be able to call into the Prime Minister's office to say, we want you to write us a law. It is the corrosive power of the 1% to get a former Supreme Court justice as their lawyer, and then to have him call another Supreme Court justice to say, we need your help. Give us a legal advice. They were undermining the Attorney General of this country. And I don't know if I need to point it out, but while Mr. Iacobucci, who I think Mr. Wernick said was no shrinking violet, they wanted to please him. They wanted to keep him happy. And yet he is representing a defendant against the government of Canada, and he's also being chosen by the Liberal government to be the key point person on the Trans Mountain consultations. How can you be that incestuous with the powerful and the rich that you could have someone fighting Canada in court, calling into the Prime Minister's office, saying, hey, I want you to change the law so I don't have to go to court. Oh, but by the way, I will be your voice in negotiations with one of the most important factors, which is the First Nation consultations on a pipeline expansion. So clearly, if this goes to court, a lot of very powerful people, a lot of very politically powerful people are implicated. And that's what the Prime Minister was concerned about. Because if the Prime Minister was concerned about people's jobs, he would have done something for the Sears workers. They did nothing. You know, he would have done something for the auto workers in Oshawa. They did nothing. But when it came to the rich and powerful who are connected to SNC, who have been found in many jurisdictions to be involved in some reprehensible behavior, building torture prisons for Gaddafi and making money out of that, that's not acceptable. So there are international implications. This is why I want to have the Prime Minister come and explain why he was so apprised from the get-go of passing this law, because it is not just something that's going to get shut down in the short term because the Liberals got to get to election. This is going to be a stench that hangs over Canada's international reputation if SNC is allowed to have that much power to interfere in the independence of the prosecution system of this country. We have to be the rule of law. We have to be able to show it, because we are a country that is involved around the world, and we cannot be seen in any manner to be favoring our own corporations over the rule of law and their obligation to meet the highest standard of ethics and legality around the world, whether it's in Montreal at the McGill Hospital, or whether it was in Bangladesh, or whether it was in Libya. All corporations must have a respect for the rule of law, and the Prime Minister must have a respect for the rule of law. And what we've seen here and what we're seeing today is that they don't have a respect for the rule of law. It's about helping the rich and powerful, and that is the corrosive power of the 1%, and that's what has to be called out.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. We have Ms. Raitt and Mr. Weir. So, Ms. Raitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just very briefly, I wanted to follow up on a point from Mr. Erskine-Smith in his very first intervention regarding improperly furthering private interests. And I do so because we're not going to hear from the Ethics Commissioner in order to defend his own report, so I thought I'd step into his shoes for a quick 2 minutes. The Ethics Commissioner on page 45, for those who care, does go into a deep understanding and a deep dive on what is improperly furthering private interests. But what may be of interest to the committee is that the former Ethics Commissioner, Mary Dawson, in fact, wrote a paper and gave a number of speeches with respect to whether or not there had been improperly furthering of private interests. And I would just want to I would just like to read this into the record, because this is the important part. It is agreed by the Ethics Commissioner, and I think by a number of people around the table, that indeed the conduct of the Prime Minister was improper in the way in which he tried to further the interest. I do believe it's also agreed in plain that the private interest of SNC-Lavalin is very evident as well. They stood to receive a huge gain should they be successful in getting the criminal charges to be diverted in another direction. That's why they put so much effort into it. So we know that it was improper. We know that there was a private interest involved, and the question comes down to, well, how can we do anything as politicians if we're not allowed to stand up for the public interest? And I would just read this to the committee, because I think Mary Dawson did it well when she said, she talked about the fact they had several cases focusing on the general prohibition found both in the Act and the Members' Code against improperly furthering the private interests of someone who may not be a relative or a friend. That's where this comes in. The qualifier improperly reflects the fact that members and public office holders routinely and legitimately further the private interests of particular groups or individuals through the formulation and implementation of public policy. Politicians in general should be able to voice their support for fellow politicians and particular political agendas, and should not be restricted from doing so on the grounds that it may incidentally result in furthering particular private interests. However, Mr. Chair, this is a very different situation, because the focus of the action in question was really only ever on the private interest of SNC-Lavalin, and the improper steps that the Prime Minister took in 4 different instances that the Ethics Commissioner enunciates in his report, of the number of times that political considerations came into the motivation for seeking to make the Attorney General change her mind. That clearly shows that it was improper. So it fails on the test of improper. It is clearly within the realm of private interest, and the Ethics Commissioner, I'm sure, would be able to explain, as I had, that it is not about whether or not a politician can lobby on behalf of their a company or a situation. What it comes down to is whether or not you do it in a proper manner, and this clearly was improper. And that is the crux and the nub of the entire report, that the Ethics Commissioner found that the Prime Minister broke the law because he improperly furthered the private interest of SNC-Lavalin and attempted to get them diverted from a criminal case into a different stream, which would be more, more beneficial for them financially, and I would expect to reputationally. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ms. Raitt. To Mr. Weir.
Thanks very much. Since we seem to have entered a bit of a broader discussion of the SNC-Lavalin case, I just want to make the point that I think it would have been far preferable had there been a more robust investigation and prosecution of the specific executives involved in alleged wrongdoing, rather than being left in this scenario of prosecuting the company as a whole, which inevitably will have negative consequences for people who had no involvement at all in the wrongdoing. I mean, whether or not members of the committee believe the figure of 9,000 jobs, I don't think anyone would dispute that going after the company as a whole is going to have negative consequences for a lot of people who are totally blameless in this thing. So I do think one of the key takeaways from the SNC-Lavalin controversy is that we should have much more effective prosecution of the individual corporate executives who are involved in wrongdoing, rather than relying on this kind of legal fiction of corporate personhood to prosecute whole enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weir, for that. I have no further people on the speaking list, so are we ready to recorded vote? So go ahead, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Angus. Mr. Kent.
Yes.
Mr. Gourd.
Yes.
Mr. Erskine-Smith.
No.
Mr. McKinnon.
No.
Ms. Fortier. Ms. Vanderbilt.
No.
Ms. McCrimmon.
No.
So the motion is defeated. Ms. Raitt, you have a comment?
I have a quick motion, Mr. Chair, if I may, and I assume it'll be disposed of very quickly, but I thought I'd give it a shot nonetheless. Given the fact that we're not going to hear from the Ethics Commissioner, and given the fact that we do have this book that is out there from Aaron Wary called Promise and Peril, that seems to indicate the Prime Minister has breached cabinet confidentiality, I move that the committee request Aaron Wary, author of Promise and Peril, a biography of Justin Trudeau, to table all recordings, notes, and other materials that he collected during his interviews of the Prime Minister that relate to materials that he collected during his interviews of the that relate to materials that fall outside the order of council.
Point of order.
Do we have notice?
Good idea.
Don't need it.
Mr. McKinnon, it's one of those things of committee. It's nice to do, but it's not required that she gives notice of her motion. The motion has come up on the floor today. She is therefore in order to present that motion.
Est-ce que c'est en français aussi?
Ms. Raitt, do you have it in français?
I do not. I ask the indulgence of the committee to still introduce it.
Non, on a.
It's always accepted. Well, you're a stranger.
Translated simultaneously as I read it.
And to be in order as well, it's not required that it's in français. So she is completely in order to present her motion as she is stating. So continue on. Is this a point of order, Mr. Angus? Okay, so
Okay.
Ms. Raitt, if you would finish.
I'll start from the beginning, sorry, because I repeat it myself. I move that the committee request Aaron Wary, author of Promise and Peril, a biography of Justin Trudeau, table all recordings, notes, and other materials that he collected during his interviews of the Prime Minister that relate to materials that fall outside of the Order in Council, waiving cabinet confidence in the SNC-Lavalin matter, so that the committee can determine whether the Prime Minister breached cabinet confidence.
So Ms. Raitt, can you say that one more time, just for the record?
Slower?
So we get you? Yeah,
I will.
exactly.
I move that the committee request Aaron Wary, author of Promise and Peril, a biography of Justin Trudeau, table all recordings, notes, and other materials that he collected during his interviews of the Prime Minister that relate to materials that fall outside of the Order in Council, waiving cabinet confidence in the SNC-Lavalin matter, so that the committee can determine whether the Prime Minister breached cabinet confidence.
Thank you, Ms. Raitt. I have Mr. Angus to speak to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and you've been an excellent chair in these past 4 years, and I want to thank you for being nonpartisan. I've kept everybody on the straight and narrow, and I have enormous respect for your work. And I have enormous respect for Ms. Raitt, but I have to vote against this in the strongest terms. We cannot use our power as parliamentarians to target journalists. We cannot demand journalists turn over evidence. We cannot demand journalists have to testify before us. That is not the role of our committee. Our committee is to hold parliamentarians to account, not the journalists. And sometimes they don't write the nicest things about me. I can't bring them forward and ask them why. But that's their role. And so there has to be that separation, a strong separation between the role of journalism and the role of parliamentarians. And that's our committee's role.
It's not really the
Thank
point.
you, Mr. Angus. I'll go to Mr. Erskine-Smith.
It's kind of off base, I find.
Made a point that I was.
We'll let the RCMP do it, I guess.
Improper for any number of reasons. It is a standing practice of our committee that there is notice. I would have expected some conversation in advance if there wasn't to be notice, but regardless, on this forget process on substance, it's not something we can support. I completely agree with Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. We'll go back to Ms. Raitt.
Thank you. I appreciate the commentary of the two members. I would expect that if it is about whether or not that it becomes public, I understand the concerns. My concern is that the Ethics Commissioner have all the information that he was not allowed to have with respect to cabinet confidence that is being freely given to other people and digested in a way that is more, I would say, sympathetic to the Prime Minister. But I'll withdraw the motion because I believe that the members don't agree with me that it's important to move ahead.
Would be nice to know.
For the committee would have to agree to have that motion withdrawn. Is that the will of the committee to do that? So you'd like to vote on it? So any further discussion on the motion? Recorded vote. So all in favor of the motion, Ms. Raitt's motion?
Are we doing?
Sorry,
It's a
Mr.
recorded vote, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mistake, Mr. Clerk. Go ahead.
Ms. Raitt.
Yes.
Mr. Kent.
Yes.
Mr. Angus. No. Mr. Erskine-Smith.
No.
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 Pittman.
No.
Bayless.
No.
So the motion is defeated. Any further discussion today? I believe we've exhausted the motions and we're ready to head home. So thank you again for coming out to Ottawa. We're adjourned.
All right, Peter Van Dusen watching along with you as the emergency meeting of the House of Commons Ethics Committee comes to an end here after about 2 hours and 20 minutes. You heard them at the end disposing of a motion from the Conservatives and Lisa Raitt calling on journalist Aaron Weary to produce.
Okay, so there we have it. It's pretty much as expected. The only real surprise was that Liberal Nathaniel Erskine-Smith that voted in support of having the Ethics Commissioner come to testify, which was ultimately defeated. Actually, let's just have a listen here. This guy's a snake.
Well, you know, what we saw in there was an awful lot of partisanship, an awful lot of speeches all about the same thing, which is just playing process games and political games on the eve of an election.
Was there any direction from the PMO on how to vote today and what to do?
No, I think we discussed it extensively and came to an independent view that we thought this was a very abject exercise in partisanship.
Do you not think there are some questions that Canadians want to hear answers to, and that this is not an important issue?
Yeah, we've had 13 hours of testimony over 5 weeks, 10 witnesses, 63-page report, which is the fruit of extensive work by the Ethics Commissioner. I think the Canadians have an awful lot of information to digest.
There's been no hearing.
We've accepted that. Mr. Dion has published a 63-page report that I know all Canadians are taking on board. We've accepted it. We've also put forward Madam McClellan's report, which I think proposes to deal with a number of the issues raised by the Ethics Commissioner. And that's going to continue. The government's excited to put those in place, and we're excited to put our agenda before Canadians.
In the last election, your government promised to do things differently. Your government promised to be open, accountable, and transparent. Does this not go against that election promise?
Well, that's why you have significant hearings by the Justice Committee. That's why we put an unprecedented waiver in place to allow the 10 witnesses to appear. That's why we've had all of these hours of debate. That's why we have a 63-page document to digest that is the product of a number of interviews itself. So this has been an exhaustively analyzed situation, and I know that Canadians have a lot of information to take on board. Certainly the government has put out some proposals with respect to the Attorney General and what Madam McClellan has put forward for as recommendations. We're going to be putting those in place. We're very excited, and we look forward to taking that to Canadians.
De recevoir un officier du Parlement quand il dépose un rapport. Le vérificateur général vient après chaque rapport. Le commissaire aux langues officielles vient après chaque rapport. Madame Dawson est venue après son dernier rapport. Pourquoi, dans ce cas-ci, alors, est-ce que vous refusez ce qui est normalement de routine?
Ce que nous avons vu dans le comité aujourd'hui, c'est un processus abject de partisanerie. Abject. Malheureusement, je pense...
Oh, I don't know what's going on. Let me close an internet connection. Or maybe I'll have to up. There we go.
Témoin, 63 pages du commissaire à l'éthique et non, donc nous sommes certains.
I'm gonna keep it like this for now. If anybody wants to follow me, Ottawa Fro on Twitter.
What, you couldn't spare one more hour?
Look, we've had 13 hours of testimony. We've had 10 witnesses. We had 5 weeks of hearings, a 63-page report. We've had a lot of information for Canadians to digest. We've put forward some very proactive and progressive proposals by Madam McClellan that we look forward to implementing, and I know that we're all excited to put those before Canadians, and we're going to continue.
Blocked witnesses. You weren't completely transparent, you know that.
Look, again, this is a partisan game. This is a partisan committee. They sent their most partisan, paint-peeling members. So I think we all know that on the eve of an election, this kind of partisan gamesmanship by the opposition is what it exactly appears to be.
Say partisan one more time.
Non, mais voilà. Donc, Madame Reid, Monsieur Poilievre, nous avons vu de la partisanerie. On envoie ces gens-là lorsqu'on veut être à notre plus partisan, et c'est ce que nous avons vu aujourd'hui.
You're the former party president. I mean, they sent you too.
Look, I think it's well known that members are pretty busy right now, and you saw a number of members from the National Capital Region, Liberal members from the National Capital Region in attendance today because it's obviously more convenient.
Mr. Poilievre is a member from the Capital Region. So why is it in his
Oui, mais il n'est pas membre du comité.
Moi,
je remplaçais un membre permanent du comité. M. Poilievre n'était pas en remplacement d'un membre du comité.
Monsieur Stilson, est-ce que vous avez quelque chose d'autre à pourquoi vous avez... Can you come to the mic, please, in English?
Steve McKinnon is good at French, but...
Is that everything for me, folks? Okay.
Enough of your lies, bud.
Duped, or what's your thoughts on that?
Look, I think it was pretty clear today that the opposition were sent here with instructions to play the most abject partisan political games on the eve of an election, and that's what they did.
Partisan, partisan, partisan. Where's the truth?
So many notes this morning, so that I had more to say at committee and less to say afterwards, after my experience last time, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do you think it's abject partisan games to want to invite the commissioner, given that it's usually quite a routine affair to have an officer of parliament come and explain the report?
So my reasons, as I stated at committee, I thought inviting the commissioner would have been a measure to increase transparency and accountability, but also I fundamentally disagree with the legal analysis. I think the commissioner got this legally wrong in many ways, and I want to ask questions about that as well.
But on the transparency argument that you just raised, and you raised in there, you're right. What does it say at the even of election to see a majority of government entities refuse what is usually routine?
I see it two ways. One, I mean, reasonable people can disagree about processes. Certainly when we had Ms. Dawson attend as commissioner after the ICON report, in some ways you could argue that it increased the report was substantive and spoke for itself.
What would you ask Mr. Dion had he attended today?
I would have asked had Ms. Wilson-Raybould as Attorney General proactively sought out advice as is contemplated by Shaw.
Jeez. I do have a lot of people living at my house, so we might be on a lot of...
2014 General Directive, and the same...
Oh, for fuck's...
proper influence.
It's gonna keep it like this.
Really furthering the interest. Therefore, Shawcross was breached, but in no way whatsoever was this a conflict of interest. In no way whatsoever did Prime Minister Trudeau breach the Conflict of Interest Act as it is.
Are you disappointed you didn't have a chance to actually, ask questions to Mr. Dion and, prove him wrong, I guess?
I would have liked the opportunity, as I said, but I also, based on initial feedback from my colleagues, I had a sense of where things were going. I had been clear at the outset that I thought it would be great to have him here to put tough questions to him after, he did a lot of work, and I think he should have an opportunity to respond to tough questions. So I made sure to lay my concerns out in detail. So, I would have liked to have had him here, but I think I got my point across at the same time.
Mr.
Last question.
Some observers on social media analyzed that it was interesting that you raised the problems with the report in your expose, saying why you would have liked to invite him, yet allowed. So you showed dissent by voting to invite him, yet you exposed how he got it all wrong. Some people think that was a smart game on the part of the government or the PMO. What is your response to that? that it might have been a nice ploy.
I guarantee you that my colleagues had wished I'd voted with them.
Pretty safe guarantee.
All right, Peter Van Dusen watching along with you. So that was Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, who actually wanted to have the ethics commissioner called before the committee. He was the only Liberal who voted in support of the motion, but his colleagues on the committee voted against him and voted against the opposition members, so that motion was defeated. And so here's Elizabeth May. Let's listen to the Green Party leader.
As someone who's followed this matter very closely, it's extremely unfortunate but predictable that the Liberals voted against allowing Commissioner Dion to come testify. This is a routine proceeding that when we've received a report from a parliamentary officer, such as our Commissioner for Conflict of Interest and Ethics, we should have been able to ask him questions. The kind of questions I would have asked him, there are references at different points in his reports to one witness said. Some of these things I'd like to know which witness. So, il dit, un témoin dit qu'il n'est pas au courant avec la différence entre le rôle de ministre de Justice et le rôle de procureur général. That's very strange. Which witness would it have been that didn't know the difference between the role of Jody Wilson-Raybould wearing her Attorney General hat and the role of Jody Wilson-Raybould wearing her Minister of Justice hat? So there are a number of questions that we should have been allowed to ask Mr. Dion. That said, I think there was a lot of unnecessary, but of course on the eve of an election, one can expect a hyper-partisanship. I don't think it is at all correct on the evidence we know that the Prime Minister told his staff to break the law. I remain unconvinced that to this day, the Prime Minister understands that what he did was wrong. To this day, I think he prefers the legal opinions of people hired by SNC-Lavalin than the accurate legal advice he received from his former Attorney General and Minister of Justice. That's really troubling, and I think we have a systemic failure here. I think that the fact that the SNC-Lavalin, as a powerful corporation, was able to extend its tentacles directly into the civil service of this country. They're supposed to be giving political people, elected people, at least to say, watch out, Mr. Minister, you can be getting right into the point where you're breaking the law. Watch out, Prime Minister, there's a principle of prosecutorial independence, and if you keep pressuring the Attorney General, you will violate that principle. No one other than the Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, advised the Prime Minister appropriately as to the law, and far too many people, as Mr. Dion's report pointed out, including Minister of Finance, President of the Treasury Board, Prime Ministerial staff, and senior members of our civil service, were doing the work of SNC-Lavalin, peddling a legal opinion from another former Supreme Court justice to undermine the confidence of cabinet in their own cabinet colleague, Privy Council officer, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was doing her job, thank goodness she did, as Minister of Justice and as Attorney General. She went to the wall to protect the rule of law in this country and protect the independence of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Yes.
You said that the results of the findings should prompt resignation. You said you were not calling for that.
No, I
So
said,
what
I didn't say should. I said what the Prime Minister did is a resignation offense. It's a question for him to decide if he should resign. In other words, it is a very serious thing to have pressured our Attorney General repeatedly and to have engaged and to have had this rather large conspiracy of members of cabinet going around behind the back of the Minister of Justice to undermine her reputation with cabinet colleagues and to do the bidding of SNC-Lavalin instead of listening to their Attorney General when she said, you're coming too close to the line. Yes, it is a resignation offense, but no, I'm not playing politics with it. I leave it to the Prime Minister to decide what he should do. At a minimum, he owes an apology to Jane Philpott, an apology to Jody Wilson-Raybould, and an apology to Canadians.
She plays both sides. She's a kind of a weasel herself. I think she has an eye on the election.
I think they've made a very large mistake here. I think they're overly. I mean, I don't know what 1 hour of testimony from Commissioner Dion could have done that would have made it so important for the Liberals to shut it down. I mean, I think he collected evidence. There is the question that we all want to know of how much was the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office obstructionist in dealing with the inquiry, how long he had to wait for information, how many requests were denied for documentation, and for the 9 additional witnesses he would have liked to question. I suppose they felt that 1 additional hour of Mr. Dion on national television would harm their electoral chances. But they also promised us greater transparency in government. They also promised us greater ethics. And I do want to say really clearly that this is not, for me as leader of the Green Party, an issue primarily about Justin Trudeau or the Prime Minister's office. This is about how much has our system of government become beholden to transnational corporations. SNC-Lavalin and this scandal gives us a spotlight for once on entirely scandalous levels of power by a transnational corporation, a homegrown one, albeit, SNC-Lavalin, facing criminal charges, was able to waylay our Minister of Finance in Davos, capture our President of the Treasury Board in Beijing. Were they afraid to hold meetings with the CEO of SNC-Lavalin in Ottawa, where people might see them going in and out the doors with each other? The nature of the evidence that was unearthed by Commissioner Dion, I found even more disturbing than the testimony before the Justice Committee of Jody Wilson-Raybould. And I was disturbed before, but when I saw that they were willing to peddle a report, again, not 1, but 2 former Supreme Court justices hired by SNC-Lavalin, a lot of people in the Prime Minister's office without any legal background, without understanding the independence of prosecutorial independence, the importance of that principle, I think they were bedazzled by a number of gentlemen who used to wear robes. And they decided to undermine the intelligence, the integrity, and the commitment to the rule of law of their own younger woman, Indigenous Minister of Justice. I think the whole SNC-Lavalin matter stinks to heaven, and I think it needs a further inquiry.
One, it has nothing to do with the fact she's a woman, nothing to do with the fact that she's Indigenous. So I really wish that we would stop playing that card.
Reaction continues to come from the Ethics Committee meeting today, where a Liberal.
I mean, race doesn't come in with everything. This is more about corruption.
To call the Ethics Commissioner to elaborate on
and here come the Conservatives.
The law in his dealings with Jody Wilson-Raybould. Let's listen to Conservatives now.
Had a chance to do the right thing and shine a little light on the SNC corruption scandal by inviting the Ethics Commissioner to develop a little context for that scathing report he tabled last week. Instead, they joined the Prime Minister in attempting this cover-up. They are complicit in his attempted obstruction of justice. I must give credit to one member of the Liberal side Mr. Erskine Smith had the independent courage to support my motion, but the other 4 members who didn't speak and who followed the direction of a hitman, a stranger to this committee who didn't understand the precedents or protocols of the responsibility of the Ethics Committee to call and to dialogue with officers of Parliament under our authority. Mr. McKinnon obviously directed those other 4 members to sit silently, to abdicate their responsibilities as members of the Ethics Committee, and to vote against, as I said, shining a little light onto this continuing SNC scandal cover-up.
I think it's because there's criminal.
Very disappointed that it's come to this point in terms of a parliamentary end, I suppose is the best way to put it. The Justice Committee shut down this investigation of what happened regarding the Prime Minister's working on the SNC-Lavalin matter because they said they wanted to hear from the Ethics Commissioner and they believe the Ethics Commissioner. The Ethics Committee said exactly the same thing. The Prime Minister said the same thing in the House of Commons. But when we get to the point of actually hearing from the Ethics Commissioner on what his process was, we don't get to hear from him. And I'll tell you why that's important. It's important because the Prime Minister of Canada has come out to say that, number one, he cooperated fully with the Ethics Commissioner, and number two, that he disagrees with some of the conclusions of the Ethics Commissioner. Now that's problematic because the Ethics Commissioner has said clearly that there were 9 witnesses that he wanted to hear from that he didn't get a chance to hear from because of the fact the Prime Minister wouldn't lift cabinet confidentiality or extend that waiver from where it ended on the day that Jody Wilson-Raybould left as the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General to become the Minister of Veterans Affairs. And secondly, the Prime Minister has never been really clear on what aspects of the Ethics Commissioner's report that he actually is in disagreement with. And I think it would be helpful to look at the report and ask the Ethics Commissioner where clearly Mr. Trudeau's submission and the Ethics Commissioner's conclusion were different. There were at least 3 times when the Ethics Commissioner said, well, this is what Mr. Trudeau said, but I don't believe him. And this is what I believe is what happened. I think it was really important for Canadians to hear from the Ethics Commissioner because otherwise it's just Mr. Trudeau commanding the microphone in public opinion and saying that the Ethics Commissioner report is wrong. If he thinks it's wrong, then he should take it to the Federal Court of Appeal because that is the appropriate path for this to go. But for him to say that it's wrong and then tell his committee members to shut down the entire process so we don't even hear from the Ethics Commissioner, we're just piling on one scandal after another, and this is really disappointing, and this is a complete abuse of an officer of the Parliament of Canada. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Accusing your party of playing partisan politics with this, of simply drawing out the issues so that you can win votes in the next election. What do you say to that?
Well, that's very disappointing comment because as parliamentarians, we vote in an ethics commissioner, and the ethics commissioner is there to ensure that the rules are being applied appropriately and that no decisions are being taken in a framework of a conflict of interest. And we always have the opportunity to ask the ethics commissioner to come in. In fact, the ethics commissioner appeared before the committee as part of his normal course of business in the spring, but he couldn't testify to this issue because it was still under investigation. I mean, it was clear we were always going to be asking the ethics commissioner to come forward and to talk about it. And the Prime Minister, through the MPs who are sitting there today, has said clearly no, he doesn't want the ethics commissioner another opportunity. So I guess what it comes down to is the Prime Minister wants to have the final word, doesn't he? He wants his sound clip out there in the media saying that the ethics commissioner is wrong, and he's going to muzzle the ethics commissioner from saying anything that can bring clarity or light to his report and his thought process in the report. And we just have his written word to deal with.
So wrong. I'll just be right back.
Oui, c'est une journée triste pour la démocratie canadienne. Personnellement, je suis très déçu. On aurait bien aimé que les libéraux n'aient pas usé leur majorité monsieur le commissaire Mario Dion de venir témoigner aujourd'hui. Il était prêt, le commissaire, il nous avait averti qu'il pouvait témoigner cet après-midi même. Il attendait la décision du comité et on aurait eu beaucoup de questions à poser sur son rapport qui est très cinglant face à M. Trudeau. Le rapport s'appelle Trudeau 2, imaginez, 2, parce que c'est le deuxième rapport, la deuxième fois dans la même session que M. Trudeau a enfreint la loi, l'article 9 de la loi sur les conflits d'intérêts. Malheureusement, M. Trudeau, le premier ministre et son entourage ont usé de leur influence contre l'ancien procureur général. Et ce qui s'ensuit, il y a des choses qui sont cachées, il y a des choses, malheureusement, qu'on s'en va en période électorale et les Canadiens ont le droit de savoir ce qui s'est passé dans ce dossier. Et malheureusement, ils ne le sauront pas parce que les libéraux l'empêchent par tous les moyens.
Votre chef a dit ce matin que ce serait la preuve, s'il refusait de débattre sur cette motion et d'entendre M. Dion, que la pourriture s'est imprégnée dans tout le caucus libéral. Vous êtes d'accord avec cette affirmation?
Ça prouve, en refusant que Mario Dion vienne parler ici, qu'il y a des choses qui sont encore à dévoiler, il y a des choses qui sont cachées et qu'on aimerait que les Canadiens soient au courant pour avoir un choix éclairé le 21 octobre.
Monsieur Gauche, juste préciser, vous étiez absent pour le premier vote. C'était délibéré ou accidentel?
Accidentel.
Oui.
On a separate subject for either Mr. Kent or Mr. Reid.
If we could just reiterate the point that Mr. McKinnon, who obviously came to control all of the members on the Liberal side with the exception of Mr. Erskine Smith, was completely unfamiliar with the practices and protocols of our committee, again, with regard to our responsibility and our authority over those several officers of Parliament. The powerful precedent of the former Ethics Commissioner, Commissioner Dawson, came to us within 3 weeks of the tabling of the first Trudeau report with the agreement of Liberals on the committee. She sat down and she discussed for fully 2 hours all of the questions from the committee. Some of those questions she deflected, but she added great depth and context to that initial Trudeau report on violation of the Conflict of Interest Act. This is an unacceptable precedent today, and as I said, Mr. McKinnon, as a stranger to this committee, came in as a hitman for the PMO, and it's absolutely outrageous that 4 of the regular members of the Liberal Committee abdicated their responsibility as members of the Ethics Committee, responsible for dialoguing with this officer of Parliament and voting the PMO line. They are complicit in the Prime Minister's incoherent, illogical excuse, his contradictory excuse of accepting responsibility but refusing to accept the conclusions.
On a separate story, there's a story that's recently out. It says 2 multi-million-dollar loans given to Irving-owned Atlantic Wallboard have just been written off by the federal government. What does that say about the federal government, especially given their history with Irving?
Well, again, it has come to light today. Obviously, an investigative journalist has found that the payment that was made to artificially create jobs in the absence of closing down an element of the Irving shipyard was a bad investment. And they are writing it off. And it's just another example of Liberal malfeasance, misjudgment, misguided judgment, providing comfort to corporate friends.
I would say this as well. I would just add this as well, that it's you're going to see a lot more stories like this as we get closer to the writ being dropped and the election date coming, where if it is perceived by this government that these are their last days, they're going to be trying to clear the decks, as it were, and help out some other folks. So I expect we're going to see this happening more and more. I expect some more stories will pop up, and I'm sure if you took a look at the latest report from the lobbying commissioner, we may be in our ridings right now, but there's a lot of lobbyists here in Ottawa talking to a lot of staffers and ministers' offices. So this is just one thing of many more that's going to be happening as we approach, I believe, the dropping of the writ in a couple weeks.
Just before you go, Mr. Kent, what was the vote on the first on your motion? The first motion it was 5-4.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
5-4.
5-4 with Nathaniel Erskine Smith on splitting a hair, saying that he thinks that the ethics commissioner got it wrong, and that's why he wants to ask him questions.
Which is reasonable. not an unreasonable position to take, because that is the traditional context that we have expected in examining reports from the officers of Parliament that we are responsible for.
Thank you, everybody.
Can I ask you a question? Like, just very.
We've got to go.
Peter Van Dusen, watching along with you now. That was the Conservatives reacting to the Ethics Committee meeting today and the decision not to call the Ethics Commissioner in a motion voted down by the Liberal majority on the committee, even though one Liberal supported it. Here's Charlie Angus from the NDP.
So frightened of that they shut down the Ethics Commissioner from presenting his report to our committee. In all my years in Parliament, I have sat many years on the Ethics Committee under the wild and woolly days of Stephen Harper, throughout the years of Justin Trudeau. I have never seen an effort to restrict the ability of an officer of Parliament from reporting to the Ethics Committee, and we saw that today. And who did it? Well, the former director of the Liberal Party was brought in to shut this down. This is about damage control, because this is about the Prime Minister of the country thinking he's above the law of the land to help very, very powerful friends in a finding of guilt that is very damning, and they will not allow him, the Ethics Commissioner, to report to us. What we saw today is obstruction, and it is a continuing of a pattern of obstruction that this Prime Minister believes he's above the law of the land of Canada, and I don't think that that's acceptable.
What would you have wanted to ask him? What specific questions?
We have
Wanted to ask him what specific questions?
We have a number of questions for Mr. Dion's report. The role of SNC in meeting with the Prime Minister, meeting with Mr. Morneau in Davos, talking to the former President of the...
I'm not crying out loud. All right, I think I'm going to stop the stream there. I think we've seen what we needed to see, which isn't much surprise. The fact that the Liberals stonewalled once again the Ethics Committee, denying the chance for the Ethics Commissioner to come and answer questions, present his findings, elaborate on what he wrote in his 63-page report. And yeah, once again, it was stonewalled. This was over like 3 hours. I missed the start of it. Basically, what you missed at the start was basically the opposition giving their speech, basically highlighting stuff in the ethics report, ethics commissioner's report. So again, I don't think you missed much there if you've been paying attention to the news. One thing that was interesting that I picked up, not from this report, but from I think a Twitter post, but 36% of Canadians weren't aware that the ethics commissioner did release a report. So hopefully with the media coverage today included, this will reach more Canadians, and they'll have more considerations on how they are going to vote in the next election, October's election, whether they still want to, well, I'm not saying everybody voted Liberal, but those that did, do they still want to support a corrupt Liberal government that's not transparent, that muzzles witnesses, that lies plainly to Canadians, to the media, and quite frankly, the media repeats it, but that's another story. But what do you guys think? Leave a message in the comment field. Follow me on Facebook. Hit me up on Twitter. Send story suggestions there if you do want to. I welcome that. I do find the best resource is the internet and the mass of people. So please shoot me your ideas. Let me know what I could have done differently in this live stream. I did want to kind of keep it silent because they were talking so much, and I didn't really want to overlap that. But yeah, I'm kind of pleased on how this stream went. Computer actually performed pretty nicely. And again, leave your thoughts in the comment field. Thanks.